You're listening to a Frequency Podcast Network production.
This season of Island Crime contains material that might be difficult to hear. Sweethearts explores themes of human trafficking, sexually exploited youth, violence, and murder. Please take care while listening. I do a lot of thinking and planning for Island Crime when I'm out on the trails on Vancouver Island with my giant dog, Bear. I don't belong to any organized religion, but I believe these times of quiet reflection in nature are an important part of producing Island Crime. If you've listened to past seasons, you'll know that when there's no real ending, no arrests, no charges, no justice for families, I look for a light. I believe there is much to be hopeful about now when it comes to Cheri, Kimberly, and Melissa's cases. In this series, I've touched on issues that could have contributed to why Cheri, Kimberly, and Melissa were killed, and why their murders were never solved. The child sex trafficking, the stigma, and the fractured police jurisdictions, to name a few. In this episode, why it's not too late to learn from the past, find justice, and bring meaning to the legacy of the lives of Melissa, Kimberly, and Cheri. I'm Laura Palmer, and this is Island Crime Season 6, Sweethearts. Episode 8, Hope.
Kim was no different than the rest of us.
Cheri was just the most adorable child that you could hope for.
Melissa, everything was kind of sparkly. She was just a joy.
She was a 16-year-old girl. She was a sweetheart.
Sweethearts is about Melissa, Cheri, and Kimberly. I hope you see them more clearly now. That you see them as more than teen hookers, and the cruel headlines that defined their murders more than 30 years ago. Addressing the stigma head-on, challenging that old narrative was a goal of this series. The stigma was something I heard repeatedly in speaking with friends and family of the young women. And of course, more than that, I'm hoping the awareness, the surfacing of details in these cases, could yet bring answers and justice for Kimberly, Cheri, and Melissa. The most likely way that's going to happen at this point is through DNA. Retired Victoria detective Don Bland.
I think there's only one way that's going to be solved now, and I'm encouraged by the type of DNA analysis they're doing now in cold cases where it's like ancestry and stuff like that. And if nobody's done it in the Kimberly Gallup case, I can't fathom why. There's absolutely no doubt in my mind that that's still under investigation. Somebody's got that file on their desk and they're still looking at it.
DNA isn't everything, but it's certainly playing an outsized role in solving cold cases in recent years. Criminologist Michael Arntfield has seen it firsthand.
It's the most important development in law enforcement since the fingerprint. The most powerful is forensic investigative genetic genealogy, or genomics as it's sometimes known, which is solving about 2 cases a week right now. Every case, even ones not currently in the conventional legacy DNA data bank, are potentially solvable using that method.
Retired Calgary detective Michelle Moffat used cold case DNA evidence to obtain one of the very first criminal convictions in Canada using forensic genetic genealogy. One of those convictions was for a crime committed in 1991, around the same time frame of the murders I've been examining in this series. It provides a tangible example of what could be possible. Detective Moffat just recently retired after 35 years of service. Most of that time was with sex crimes and cold case investigations.
DNA in cold case investigations is everything. I mean, honestly, if you don't have DNA in cold case investigations, you're probably never going to be able to get the file to the point where you're charging and going to court.
Detective Moffat unwinds the story of how she was able to send a rapist to jail for a crime he committed 30 years ago. It all begins back in May 1991, when a 28-year-old woman calls 911.
911, what's the emergency, please?
It was a situation where a young mother, she had an infant child at home with her, and she was home alone. Her husband was out for the night. During the evening, late evening hours, an unknown male broke into her residence through a basement window. When she heard some noises and her dog was barking, she went to the back door, and when she did that, the offender ran up the stairs at her. Then she went into her kitchen, closed the kitchen door, locked it. He kicked through the kitchen door and attacked her and sexually assaulted her a couple times before he left the residence, and she was able to get police attendants there. You can only, imagine what it would be like as a victim of a crime like this, but honestly, unless you've actually lived it and gone through it, I look at stuff like this and I think I can't imagine how terrifying that would be. And in this case, she also had an infant in the house. So I'm sure it was not only her safety and was she going to live or die, but I'm sure it was thinking about her baby as well.
This horrifying attack takes place in Calgary in 1991, around the same time of the murders of Kimberly, Cheri, and Melissa here on the island. I want to know how DNA evidence is being viewed back then.
In 91, DNA was, as far as police and investigations and that, and really in Canada, it was in its infancy, right? But they had the wherewithal and the knowledge that obviously, as time passes, technology advances, all that kind of stuff. So it was the practice back then, and thank goodness that, the victim would have been taken to a hospital and a sexual assault examination and collection of exhibits would have been taken. But in 91, there was only so far you could go with something like that, as opposed to in this day and age, we immediately, the first thing we want, or we know we're going to get really valuable evidence from, is DNA. So it's collection of swabs from the body of the victim, right? And of course, what you're hoping to get in a sexual assault is the DNA from the male from those swabs.
The case Detective Moffat is speaking about involves a situation where thankfully the victim survives and DNA is collected quite quickly. That would have been possible in Kimberly Gallup's case as well. Melissa Nicholson's body is discovered a few days after she disappears. Her body has been outside, but DNA evidence should be possible there too. Cheri Lynn Smith wasn't discovered for 3 months. It was summer, and reports at the time mentioned decomposition. But even though DNA does degrade, it can last for a very long time. And I think of that blanket used to cover Cheri's body. Investigators on the Boston Strangler murders, which occurred in the 1960s, used DNA taken from a blanket at one crime scene to match to a family member of Albert DeSalvo, the man who we now know was indeed the killer. I imagine that blanket and other evidence from the cases I'm talking about, stored away in banker boxes, somewhere here on the island, waiting. I asked Detective Moffat to walk me through the process police would have gone through back then.
So the actual swabs from the body of a victim, back in 91, there would have been a little plastic clear box. Those would have been dried and properly packaged and labeled, put back in that little plastic box, and then it would be put in within another box. So the banker's box you're talking about, along with other exhibits. Quite often it was at that time, and now it would be the victim's clothing items, right, that have been dried and properly sealed in a bag and put into this, what you would say is a banker box.
We know from the information revealed on the Victoria Police Union podcast that an investigator has been re-examining Cheri's case in recent years. Here's how Detective Moffat describes what that process looked like for her.
So as a cold case investigator, you find a file, you look at what's on our system. In other words, what reports and statements and any kind of documentation we have. But of course, the biggest thing you want is DNA. So that's when a detective goes over to the property unit and asks for all the exhibits in relation to, this file to be pulled. And you hope you get a box and you go back into our property unit and, start going through what's in the box and what exhibits are there. And sometimes you're really fortunate that exhibits have been retained over the years. And in some cases, you're not, right? Something hasn't been retained because the protocols for collection of exhibits today's day and age is different than what was happening 30 years ago, right? A lot of times with cold case, you kept your fingers crossed. And when you got there and you got a box and you opened it, you hoped for the best, but you quite often expected the worst, right?
I wonder, have the police had that experience in investigating Melissa, Kimberly, or Cheri's cases? Did they open up a box, find DNA swabs? And if so, what next?
At that point, then you just look at what exhibits you have, which exhibits you think are going to be the best possibility for finding a male DNA profile, which is obviously the swabs from the body of the victim. And then the next process is to a request for forensic analysis, and that's sent to the RCMP crime lab. Then they'll send back an email to say that they've approved X, Y, and Z exhibits for analysis. And then we have those exhibits pulled back out of property and shipped to the lab to be analyzed.
Next, a lab analyzes the exhibits, looking for an unknown DNA profile, which is what police are hoping for. If they obtain something, the RCMP Crime Lab enters that DNA profile into the National DNA Data Bank of Canada.
So it consists of DNA from convicted offenders in Canada. What they're doing is if we get a male DNA profile, an unknown male DNA profile, then they enter it into the DNA data bank. And if you're fortunate, you're going to get a DNA data bank hit to a known offender who has his DNA submitted to the Data Bank of Canada, and then you'll get notification of a DNA match.
Now, that's the best case scenario for a cold case investigator. Until recently, if you didn't have a DNA data bank hit, cold case detectives were left with the basics. Taking another look at original suspects in the investigation, re-examining witness statements, and doing groundwork for themselves. And that's a tough slog.
Well, the biggest challenge is, with cold case is like rebuilding the file and looking at what the original investigators, who they were interviewing, if they had identified a person of interest, if that person of interest had been eliminated and how they eliminated that person of interest. And if you rule out those people, then you start generating your own person of interest based on, historically you can look at who was offenders at that time period in the area, and you look at various things like that.
Michelle says the use of genetic genealogy advanced the technology and helped further investigations. The arrest of the Golden State Killer puts Investigative Genetic Genealogy Technology, or IGG, in the spotlight. IGG is the process where DNA websites like Ancestry.com and 23andMe are used to find a killer's family. The technology sparks Detective Moffat's attention. She and her partner see the potential to identify the man who attacked that young mom in her home all those years ago.
It was kind of a learning curve to find out, how you get this done. But the bottom line is we ended up being in contact with a lab down in the States that did genetic genealogy DNA analysis of male unknown profiles. And so there's several steps through police procedures to get approval to be able to do that because it's brand new. It's not like TV. So in other words, you actually have to take some of your male DNA that's in storage and take some of that. So it's about, well, I'm not sure where they're at now, but let's say 2 nanograms. And you have to ship that to the States. So you're using up some of your male DNA profile that you have in storage.
In Season 3 of Island Crime, I spoke with genetic genealogy expert Cece Moore about how the technology could potentially help solve the abduction of 4-year-old Michael Dunahee. It's an incredibly powerful tool. At the time of publishing, hundreds of criminal cases have been solved using IgG. With that promise comes concern. Concern about how donors' genetic information could be used. Privacy and civil liberties experts warn that commercial DNA databases are being used for purposes beyond identifying missing people, and that family members may not realize the risks of contributing to them. It's controversial, and the technology is rapidly advancing.
And I don't want to get too complicated, but they do a different process in order to get genetic information out of it as opposed to just the DNA profile. They then send it back to you, but it's not as simple as, oh, ding, 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 this is your guy.
Detective Moffat and her partner face a steep learning curve. Back then, there are no genetic genealogy researchers working with the police. So they chip away at the case without ever telling the victim, now a woman in her 50s, that they could be getting close to identifying the man responsible for assaulting her all those years ago.
Probably one of the hardest, phone calls that I make in my career is that. Because I know fully well that when I do get that victim on the phone and I do tell them who I am and why I'm calling, I'm releasing trauma. All of a sudden, maybe something they buried for years, right? But something that they have moved on in life or tried to move on in life because, depending on the person, some people are able to kind of just move on and have what, we would consider a normal existence or, of a person. And some victims of these crimes it's just devastated their entire life. So when we make that phone call, you just don't know how it's going to be taken, what the reaction is going to be. So it's a really difficult call.
I tried to put myself in the victim's shoes. You've been a victim of a horrible crime. You've tried to forget, to move on. And then one day, a call from police you never expected. How would you react?
Very shocked, surprised, a lot of silence as they listen to us tell them what, who we are and what we investigated and that we want to set some time aside for them to be able to process the information that we've just given them and, set up a time to meet them and that kind of thing. And their reactions are sometimes tears just from the release of the police getting a hold of them. A lot of them think we've forgotten about them.
Could the person or persons responsible for the murders of Melissa, Kimberly, and Cheri yet be identified using IgG? Here's how Detective Moffat describes what it's like to knock on the door of a suspect 30 years on, when you finally have the evidence of their guilt.
Just completely shocked. And yet, basically, it said they had been looking over their shoulder for 30 years, waiting for the police to come get them.
It's a remarkable story. The man who attacked that young mother was 18 at the time. He is almost 50 when he pleads guilty and is sentenced to a 7-year jail term. But despite this kind of success, critics warn of genetic surveillance, raising ethical questions about whether police are taking advantage of the at-home DNA testing trend. Criminologist Michael Arnfield has no time for those kinds of concerns. he's now doing PR work for GEDmatch, the databank that relies on these third-party, direct-to-consumer home DNA kits.
Part of what I do is try to educate people on how this works, get law enforcement to consider this as a investigative tool in just about every case. Even at the end, if there's no DNA on file already, exhibits, if they're properly stored from these cases, can yield DNA through these private labs that are recovering just nanograms of DNA for comparison. Because again, the GEDmatch databank uses a type of DNA, SNP DNA or SNP, which only requires a very small amount in order to make a familial comparison versus the comparatively significant amount required in the police databank right now.
Arnfield believes police involved in cold cases, like those of Melissa, Kimberly, and Cheri, should be turning to IgG. And he worries that Canadian police have been overly cautious when it comes to embracing the technology's promise.
They jealously guard these cases, even though they've been completely useless with them for decades in some cases. And then the other one is just ignorance. They don't understand how the system works. They don't want to face a court challenge. And I'll be clear, in Canada, there is every case that has utilized forensic investigative genetic genealogy has either revealed an offender who's deceased, so they don't have their day in court, or they plead guilty. So 2 cases were just cleared in Toronto, 2 sex homicides from the early 80s that were linked by DNA, and he pleaded guilty very quickly. So again, there's never been an evidentiary or factual test as to the admissibility of this technique. But when we look to the States, there's been tons of court challenges and it holds up. At the same time, though, no police service necessarily wants to be the first one to have to explain they were out of options, so they use this technique with a private lab in the US and go through, be examined on all that. So I think they're a little bit leery of that, but that's not an excuse to not solve your cases.
According to Arnfield, it has been left to families of victims to advocate for the use of technology to police forces who are at times reluctant.
I've heard horror stories where, the family will advocate for the use of genetic genealogy and just absurd, uneducated responses like, oh, there's not enough DNA for that to be used. Well, again, I've already mentioned you only need a fraction of the DNA that is customarily and historically used by law enforcement in the legacy databank CODIS. So if it's in CODIS, you don't need any more DNA. All you need to do is compare the crime scene sample to the GEDmatch database, which isn't just looking for known offenders or convicted offenders who have their DNA on file. It's looking at the entire global population.
He's upfront about his relationship with the online DNA company GEDmatch. In my experience speaking with him, he's been a pretty serious, intense guy. But he's nearly giddy in his enthusiasm for IgG.
I was with GEDmatch at a conference in Florida, and we had people randomly coming up to terminals and uploading their home kits. And someone who just happened to be at this conference, we were monitoring 2 cases live using GEDmatch Pro, and this young lady uploaded her home DNA kit, and she's the 3rd cousin to the killer in one of these cases that's been cold for 20 years. So now we're into that family tree. So that's gone from no leads in 20 years to, the lead investigator was there, and we're like an uncle or a first cousin away from the killer now. So it'll be solved within a year after 20 years just because she uploaded her sample.
The technology and its promise as a crime-fighting tool really is incredible. So much so that he is almost reluctant to brook any discussion regarding privacy concerns.
Those who say, well, it's genetic privacy, this and genetic privacy that. No, if you opt in, you have clearly read all the terms of use, and you have to proactively go through 2 separate stages in order to make your DNA accessible. Of course, you're going to get the typical hand-wringing, classic Canadian bleeding hearts who say, well, the offender's not opting in. That's their genetic privacy. Well, a serial child sex killer has a privacy interest in what their 14th cousin 3 times removed that they've never met does with their home DNA kit. Good luck with that. I mean, the people making that argument are part of the problem, and you can't stop the future, and this is the future.
Retired Detective Michelle Moffat agrees the potential for law enforcement is huge. She gauges its success on what it means for the victims.
When we have a conviction at the end of it and we have the victims who are happy about the outcome, it is an absolute win for us, for sure.
The investigators in charge of Cheri, Kimberly, and Melissa's cases have not agreed to speak with me on the record. So I don't know if they have DNA evidence in all three cases. And I don't know if they're trying to push forward using IgG. I asked retired Detective Moffat if she sees potential to finally solve these cases.
You know, every case is different, and it just really depends. It depends on the condition of the body when they find it. It depends on what weather conditions that time frame was. I mean, I'm always of a thought there's always potential for DNA. I mean, it's what solves cases now. If you don't have DNA, you're not solving a case, and the potential is huge. When I look back in the early 20s when I was in sex crimes to where we're at now, it's just huge. And even the next step of IgG. I mean, I never in my mind ever thought that was even something possible. And then look, you fast forward 20 years or so and, look at the potential. So yeah, it's amazing. DNA doesn't lie.
Michael Arnfield takes it a step further. He's a true believer in the cause of IgG.
The best thing a true crime consumer can do is to do a home DNA kit and upload your sample to GEDmatch. Another 1 million or so samples, and every single suspect is going to be out of time, because within 2 weeks of these cases being sent to a lab, we will be into your family tree within one cousin.
I hope he's right. Advances in DNA should mean progress is happening in these cases. I want to acknowledge that the series has likely raised many questions that I have been unable to answer as of yet. Keen Island Crime listeners may have noticed that Cheri Lynn Smith's body is found very close to a Saanich location, which is raised in Season 3 of Island Crime. A suspect in the abduction of Michael Dennehy worked at the stable near where Cheri's body is found. I don't know if the man I call the Brown Van Man was ever a suspect in Cheri's case, but it felt worth noting. Cheri and Kimberly were both pregnant. Melissa's boyfriend, Daryl, told me he had heard a rumor that Melissa, too, had been pregnant and may have miscarried before she was killed. That information is unconfirmed. Teenagers being sex trafficked, especially back then, could easily have become pregnant. And whether there is any reason to believe this could have something to do with their murders remains another unanswered question. As far as I know, the suspect in Kimberly Gallup's case, who was seen leaving the hotel room, is the only suspect directly linked to a crime scene. Cheri and Melissa's killers are believed to have picked them up on the stroll and killed them elsewhere before disposing of their bodies outside the city. If the three deaths are linked, why was the killer on foot the night of Kimberly's murder? Back in 1991, Victoria Police said they had forensic evidence connecting Kim's case to Vancouver-based cases. What is that evidence? And finally, the police officer who spoke on the Police Union podcast mentions a possible connection between 7 or 8 cases, including some missing women. If the police ever agree to speak about their work on these cases, I will certainly update the series. I hope those who love Cheri, Kimberly, and Melissa will get answers. And maybe, one day, peace. Sweethearts began with an email from Kimberly Gallup's high school friend Rhonda. who asked that I look into Kim's case. Rhonda is a writer, and she has a lovely way with words.
At 50, one realizes that 17 is a continent away. A continent where high school now resides in a dim and murky realm full of sun flares and torn edges. Each day, less can be recalled. Memories begin to fragment and collapse. The last time I saw Kim, she was standing in the hall near the principal's office. What was she wearing? I don't know. Probably something fashionable with earrings to match. Soft colors, pinks and blues. Carefully applied makeup, her curls styled perfectly. What did we say to each other? I can't remember. Is it even a true memory anymore? It's so hard to tell. Yet, I get flashes of her there. She gives me a wave. Her face is tranquil, serene. She is not smiling, nor is she unhappy. I wave to her and walk away.
When I first started researching the murders of these 3 teenagers, I was unprepared for how much of a role the issue of sex trafficking would play in the story. And I was uninformed about how real the dangers are here in Canada today. See the Trafficking Signs is a great free resource from the Joy Smith Foundation. I've asked a young friend to voice this, and I'm really hoping these words will reach someone who needs to hear them.
Here's 9 signs you should watch out for. A sudden interest in a man several years older. New clothing, jewelry, or gifts without having any money. Frequent sleepovers at a friend's house. A sudden change in style of makeup or dress. A new circle of friends and isolation from the old group. Change in attitude towards school and regular activities. Grades are dropping. Unexplained cuts or bruises. And using 2 cell phones. Stay alert and stay safe.
If you or someone you know may be a human trafficking victim, call the Canadian Human Trafficking Hotline at 1-833-900-1010. The hotline is a confidential, multilingual service. It operates 24/7 to connect victims and survivors with social services, law enforcement, and emergency services. It also receives tips from the public. Thank you to everyone who shared their memories, stories, and expertise. Special thanks to the families of Melissa, Kimberly, and Cheri. Stephanie Phillips is our showrunner. Sound design by Christy Chan. Mary Jubran is our digital editor. And Diana Kay is our business manager. Jordan Heath Rawlings is our executive producer. I'm Laura Palmer, and this is Sweethearts, Island Crime Season 6. Please take a moment to rate and review the podcast.